In this video, we will be integrating the user authentication into the Tasks API. The logic for this will be to perform a user and session check based on the provided access token. This will be checked to make sure that it hasn't expired, that the user is active, and that they are not currently locked out. The API will then proceed based on the route that the client is using. The SQL queries will be changed so that they only perform the tasks based on the newly added user ID field, which is held against the task. This prevents a user from being able to retrieve or modify other users' tasks. So let's start by opening Atom and adding in the user access token check. So this is our sessions API. We're just going to close that because we're not going to use this anymore. And we're going to open up our task API here. So this is the task controller. So what we're going to do is, before it then decides on which route that we're taking, we're going to add in the authorization script here. This will be used to check the access token and just to make sure that it's valid, it hasn't expired, and that the user is valid. So if I just create some space here, and I'm just going to add a comment to say begin auth script, just so we know what belongs to the authentication side and what belongs to the tasks API. And just below this, I'm just going to add another comment to say end auth script. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is to get our access token from the HTTP header, which is for authorization. We've done this in a previous video regarding refreshing an access token. So we'll be doing the same sort of checks. So we'll first need to make sure that the access token has been provided and that the access token, is not just an empty string, just blank. So we'll do that now. Just scroll down just so it lifts it up. So we'll do the if statement, and then we need to check if it's not set, and it was the server global variable, and it was for the HTTP authorization header. So if it's not set, but also we need to, or strlen is less than 1, and I'll just add it in here. So server HTTP authorization. Then, so this is our if statement. So checks to make sure that the authorization header is present and that the authorization header does contain a value that is greater than 0 characters, so it's not empty. If it's not, we need to set up our standard error response. So we'll create that now. So new response, and then response set HTTP status code, and this will be a 401 because we're not authorized at this point. So we do obviously the authorization check before we do any other logic in the API. Obviously we've got to have the database connection created here because the authorization logic will be querying the database. So we must do the connection to the database at the beginning. So response set success, and that's false. And then response, what we're going to do here is to use the ternary operator to provide error messages based on if it's not provided or if it's, if it's blank. So we will do the is set, and then it's underscore server, and then it is HTTP underscore authorization. So if it's not set, then we need to response add message. And the message will be access token is missing from the header. Not from the header. Too many quotes there. Put this back in quotes. Otherwise false. Okay, so if we copy this, because the next check we need to do is for the string length. So if I just change this, so strlen, and then it is server HTTP underscore authorization, and if that is less than 1, we need to change this access token. access token cannot be blank. Okay, so response, and then we need to send and then exit. So we'll handle that exactly the same. We're just checking to make sure the access token has been provided and that it's not an empty string. Okay, the next thing we need to do is, if it has been provided, then we need to store this in a variable. So we'll call this access token, and we will get it from the server HTTP authorization header. Okay, so we've got that, and the next thing we need to do is then perform a database query based on this access token to bring back the user details and the session details. So we can check that the user's active and that the access token and stuff hasn't expired. This is very much similar to what we've done in the refresh access token API, where we do some basic checks before we then proceed with the rest of the logic. So we need to create the query. So, oops, query, spelled it wrong again, equals, and because it's authentication, we'll always do it against the right DB. Obviously, I think you've got that message now. Prepare, and we'll create the SQL query. So we want to bring back the user ID, because this user ID we're going to use in the rest of the SQL queries in this script, and that's how we apportion tasks to or set ownership of tasks to users. So we need to bring back the user ID based on the provided access token, because we need to make sure that the user ID matches throughout this the rest of the logic. So user ID, access token, expiry, user active, and login attempts, and then that's from TBL sessions and TBL users. Users, where TBL sessions dot user ID equals TBL users dot ID, because we need to link the two tables to make sure that we'll bring back the right user for the the access token that's been provided. And access token equals access token. So obviously that's a placeholder. Now we need to bind the parameter, so query bind param, and it will be access token, and this will be the access token that we've received in, because we need to do the check on the one that the user's provided, and this is PDO param, and it's a string. So now if we execute that, query execute, and we need to do a row count, because this will say, well, there is no user or session for that access token that's been provided. So if someone provides an access token that's not valid, doesn't exist, this is the error handler here for that, for the row count. So we'll do row count equals query, and then that is row count, and then we need to do an if statement on that. So if row count equals 0, and what we need to do here is to send a response back. So I'm just going to copy this one up here to save some time, paste it in here, and it's still going to be a 401 error because we're unauthorized. You've provided an access token that's not valid. Success is false, but I don't need 2 error messages, I just need 1. So I'm just going to get rid of these ternary operators here and then just set a message, because there's only 1. So add message, oops, and we'll say invalid access token. Okay, so that's the first main check really, to see if there is a session for that access token. So if there is, we need to return everything that we have retrieved here, because we need to perform some checks. Like I say, we're going to use that throughout this anyway. Obviously we need to check that the access token has is still valid. We're not really bothered about the refresh token at this point because we're not handling that. That's what the authentication API does. We need to check that the user is active and that they haven't exceeded the login attempts. So if we return the row, so row equals query fetch, oops, and then it is PDO fetch associate of array. So we're returning one row because there only should be one row for an access token, because we put the condition on the database to say there can only be one unique access token. So we'll bring back the row. We now need to save the details that we get from the SQL query in variables so we can use them. So returned user ID, and that's from the row user ID, and then returned what was it, access token expiry, and that is from row access token expiry. And the next one was the user active, so it was user active, yeah, and that was from the row user active. Returned login attempts from the row login attempts. Okay, so now we need to do the checks for user active to begin with. So we'll do that now. We need to do if returned user active is not equal to y, and then we need to send back a response. So we'll copy this one. It's a 401 error. That's correct because there's an authentication issue, and we'll change this to user account not active. That's okay. And the next check we need to do is to make sure the login attempt is not equal to 3 or greater. So if we do that now, if returned login attempts is greater than or equal to 3, then we're going to copy this response again, 401 error, and then we're going to say user account is currently locked out. Okay, so the final check we need to do is to make sure that our access token is valid so that it hasn't expired. So scroll down, and if we do if, and then we're going to need to use string to time and then compare it with the current time. So in one of the previous videos we done this very similar check for the refresh token to make sure the refresh token was still valid as we're trying to refresh a session. This time we're going to be working on the access token, so we're going to obviously use this against the access token this time. So str to time, and then it is returned access token expiry, and if it's less than the current time, then that means it's expired. So if we copy this and paste this response here, it's still a 401 error, and then we'll just change the message to say access token expired. Now if a user does get this, as they use our API, then that's when they then have to submit a refresh token to get a new access token. So this is the response that the client will get once the 20 minutes is up for the valid access token. They then have to call the refresh API with the refresh token to then get a new access token to be able to still continue using this. Okay, so let's have a quick check at this. Alright, I forgot something here. Because we're doing a database query, we haven't actually put it in our try and catch statement. So let's get rid of this. We just need to put this in our try and catch. So I'll just indent this slightly. Just go down to there, and then we'll indent, Yeah, that should be fine. Okay, so at the end of this script, obviously we've started our try at the top there. We need to end our try after this string to time, checking the access token, and then we need to perform the catch, which is a PDO exception EX. Oops. So forgive me for that, I've just forgot to add it in there. You think that I would know by now after all the database queries we've carried out. So in the catch statement, what we need to do is send an error response back if there's ever a database problem, and 500 error because there's obviously been some sort of server issue, and then change this to there was an issue authenticating, please try again. Okay, and that sends that. Just remove that. Okay, so I think that is it. That's the beginning of the authentication script. So first of all, we are double checking to make sure the authorization or access token has been provided in the authorization HTTP header, that it's not blank. If it is, we send an error response back. We then get the access token, save it in a variable. We'll then perform a query, a SQL query on TBL sessions and TBL users. We'll link the two tables together based on the user ID, and we'll check that the access token, the one that's provided, is, that matches to a user session. We're not bothered about it being expired at the moment. We just want to make sure that it matches a user session. If there isn't a session that is matched to that access token, we'll provide back invalid access token and the script ends. Otherwise, we get the row from the database, which has the user ID in, because we're going to use that in a second. And then we get the access token expiry, the user active, and the login attempts, because now we perform these checks here. So make sure the user's active, make sure the login attempts are under the 3, because once they hit 3, then they're locked out and they have to be manually unlocked. We'll then do a check on the access token expiry to make sure that it hasn't expired. If it has expired, we send back an error response to say access token has expired. And then obviously we've got our catch statement, the bit I missed out before. Okay, so now that we've got that bit, what we need to do is, for each of the SQL queries, for each of the routes that's in the rest of this script, we need to just make sure that each one is taking into account the user ID. So we're not doing any further checks on that. All we're going to do is update the SQL queries, because at the minute, what's this one? This is getting a single task here. So we're providing the task route, and it's the get request. So we're just getting a single task. Now you can see here, we return the task details based on the task ID. So if someone knows the task ID, then it's just returned. But what we want to do is add a further condition to the SQL queries to say, and where user ID is the same as the one that matches the access token that's provided. This will stop people from trying to guess task IDs that they don't have access to, or that that doesn't belong to them. So we're just going to whiz through this script here and just update this as we go. So like I say, this first one here is to get an individual task based on a task ID, because it's under the get request. So all we're going to do is scroll right to this, and where it says and ID equals task ID, we're just going to put a further condition to say and user ID equals placeholder user ID. So it's just constricting that SQL query down. So because we've provided another placeholder, we need to bind a variable to that here. So after task ID, we will create another query, bind param, and it is user ID. So like I say, we've already retrieved the user ID based on the access token that's been provided. If you scroll up here, obviously we're doing that check here. So we need to use this value that's stored in this variable throughout this script. So I'll scroll down. So user ID, and it needs to be returned user ID. Oops. And that is a PDO param integer. So that's the first endpoint or route adjusted to take into account our users. So what we're going to do is just scroll down. We don't need to update any models or anything like that, because the user or the client is not interested in a user ID. This is only internal to the system. The user is normally just aware of their username, which is either an email address or just, a general unique text code or something like that. So we don't need to adjust our model to perform or to allow the user ID to be stored as a task or anything like that. We literally just using this for validation in the back end of the system. So what we're going to do is just scroll down these this code here and just double check where there's a SQL query. So I'll just keep scrolling down. So this one here, we're working on the delete. So this is to delete a single task. So you can see here that this SQL query here is very generic. If you've got the task ID, that means you can delete it. Doesn't matter if it's yours or not. It'll just delete it. So we need to constrict this slightly and just put and user ID equals user ID. And then we need to bind it to the query. So query bind param, and it was user ID, and remember it is the returned user ID, and that it's PDO param integer. Okay, so that's the delete one now modified, so it only takes into account tasks that you have access to or that belongs to you. Okay, I'll scroll down again. Okay, now we're looking at the patch, which is to update a task. So I'll scroll down to that SQL query. This one's a little bit obviously complicated because we're doing some dynamic query generation here based on what fields are being updated. But if we scroll down, it still has the SQL query here. So this one here, because this has got multiple ones, we fetch a task back. So that's the select. So we still need to update this one to take into account our user ID. So and user ID equals user ID, because otherwise it would allow a user to modify someone else's task that doesn't belong to them. So we don't want that. So we'll bind that parameter. So query bind param, and this is for user ID and returned user ID, and it's PDO param integer. So we'll scroll down again till we see our update. So because we're building this dynamically, obviously the query field is being built up dynamically, but it's still the same case where obviously we're focusing on a task, but we also want a task ID as well as making sure that the user ID is the same for that task. So and user ID equals user ID, and we need to bind this, but the bind for this one is further down. If we go down, keep going down, you can see there that's where we're binding the task ID, so it's directly after this one, query bind param, and it is user ID, and it is the returned user ID, and that's PDO param integer. Okay, we're getting there, so keep going down. And this one here is still part of the update task, because remember, we'll get the task originally, we'll perform the updates on the task that we've retrieved, and then we'll send that back to the database, and then we retrieve the new task again, or the updated task. So we also need to adjust this SQL query. So right at the end, and user ID equals user ID, and then we need to bind the parameter. Query bind param, user ID, returned user ID. That's wrong. PDO param integer. Okay, so that's the task update. Looks like it's complete. So I'll scroll down. So the next one is to, it was get all completed tasks. Remember the route for that, which was /tasks/completed. So the SQL query is here. So we'll just move to the right of that, because we only want to list the tasks that belong to us, that's completed. So and user ID equals user ID. and we need to bind the parameter. So bind param user ID returned user ID, PDO param integer. Scroll down. So basically we're updating all the SQL statements. So this is the page root now. So this will have it here. So this is the count of how many tasks, because remember this is the total number of tasks for our user now. So we need to do where user ID equals user ID. This, and then obviously this one doesn't have any parameters, but we need to bind the param. So we need to do query bind param user ID returned user ID PDO param integer. So obviously this is where it works out how many pages is needed for all of your tasks for this user ID now. So scroll down, and then we need to retrieve the tasks. So right at the end of this, and this one is before the limit, because the limit must come after the where clause. So after we've done from TBL tasks, we need to put where user ID equals user ID, and then it's the limit clause, which restricts how many results is brought back based on obviously our page offsets. So we'll add that in. We need to bind the parameter. So if we just add it in just above this, so query bind param, and then we'll do user ID returned user ID PDO param integer. Scroll down again to the next SQL query. Keep going. So this one, we now want to do the empty, which is the just slash tasks. So this one gets all tasks. So we need to get all tasks for our user, because at the minute this will just get all tasks within the database. So at the end we need to change from TBL tasks where user ID equals placeholder user ID. We then need to bind the parameter. So query bind param user ID returned user ID PDO param integer. Scroll down again, and the post one is used to create a task. So this is exactly the same. When we create a task, obviously you still need your access token, and we're just going to append that on the end of the insert. So if I scroll down, so you can see here, here's our insert. So this one's slightly different because obviously we need to add an extra field into here, because this is what we're telling which columns it needs to be inserted. So this one was user ID, if you remember, because against each task there's now an associated user ID. So user ID, and then we're going to put the value right at the end before the bracket. So comma, and then it's placeholder user ID. And then we need to bind this parameter. So just underneath completed, so it's query bind param user ID returned user ID PDO param integer. Okay, so scroll down, and that's obviously the creation, but now we need to obviously that's the retrieving, because when you create something you should always return it back to the client. So we need to now update this SQL statement, so where ID equals task ID and user ID equals user ID, and then we'll need to bind this parameter. So query bind param, and then it's user ID returned user ID PDO param integer. Okay, scroll down, keep going, and that is it. So now our tasks API should now be user centric. So this should allow us to create tasks, update tasks, delete tasks based on users. So what we're going to do is now test this out. So scroll back to the top. And then what we're going to do, I just want to start fresh here. So I'm going to go into PHP MyAdmin, and you can see that we've got some data in here, but I just want to start fresh. So what we do is go to TBL sessions. I just want to empty this out. So TBL sessions, operations, scroll down, and we're going to empty the table. We're going to disable foreign key checks and click OK. We're going to do the same for TBL tasks, operations, empty the table, undo foreign key checks, OK. And the same for TBL users. TBL users, operations, scroll down, empty the table, untick, OK. So now if we go back to TasksDB, we've now got a brand new clean database for us to mess about with. So if I go to Postman, and if we think about this logically, what I want to try and demo here is logging in as a user, get our access token. I then want to create a task for that user. I then want to retrieve the task for that user. But then what I want to do is create a new user, create a totally different task, and then show you that the tasks are independently retrieved based on who's logged in. So the first thing we need to do is create two users. So HTTP localhost port 8888/v1/ to create a user we use users, and this is a post, and we'll go to body raw, change to JSON because we need to provide some user details here to create the users. So the first one was full name for a user, and I'm just going to call this Michael Jones. We need to create a username, and we're going to call this one Michael, and we need to provide a password. So the password for Michael is going to be password1. So we'll create that, so we'll send. So you can see now that we've got a user, it has a user ID of 1 and the username's Michael. I'm just going to keep these tabs open because I might need to refer to them because I might get mixed up where we are. So I'm just going to create a new tab because we need to create a new user again from our history here. So localhost port 8888/v1/users to post request. We need to provide a JSON body. So that's going to be full name again. And this one, we'll call this person, I don't know, something like John Smith. I think that's fine. And then username, and we'll just call him John. I mean, a username could be an email address, it could be anything you want as long as it's unique. So then password, and we'll call this password 2, just so it's different to the Michael user. So we'll submit that. So now we've got two users, and if we go into our PHP MyAdmin, go to users, browse, you can see that we've got two users, username Michael, username John, two different user IDs, a hashed password, both users are active, both have 0 failed login attempts, so that's good. So now what we want to do is go back to this. Now we've got our users, I just want to show you what happens if we try and use the Tasks API without logging in. So I'll create a new request, and what we're going to do is just use http://localhost port 8888/v1/tasks. Now remember, get/tasks should get all tasks in the database. We don't have any at the moment, but what you should see is an authentication error. So if I send that, you can see access token is missing from the header. So now that, this is different. It's now taken into account that we must log in to be able to retrieve or update or, delete tasks. So we'll get an access token. So now if we create a new tab across the top, like I say, I'm keeping these open because I may need to refer to them. HTTP localhost 8888/v1/ want to log in, so sessions. And this one's going to be a post because we're creating a session, so we're logging in. Obviously it needs a JSON body. So body raw application JSON, and we need to provide a username. We'll log in as Michael to begin with, and a password, and Michael's password was password1. So if I send that, what you'll see now, we've logged in, we've got an access token, we have a valid session. So we'll copy the access token. And like I say, we only send the access token on requests. We only ever send the refresh token when we refresh a session. This is why access tokens have a smaller expiry time than what the refresh token is, because there's actually more chance of it getting compromised or leaked because we send it on every request. That's why you have a short duration. So we've copied the access token. We'll go back to our get tasks API. Go to headers. Remember, it's an HTTP header for authorization, and this is where we provide our access token. So we'll paste it in there and we'll send. So you can see now that it seems to be working. You know, we've logged in. The access token's valid. Success is true, but obviously we don't have any tasks at the moment. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a task for Michael. So create a new tab, and then http://localhost port 8888/v1/tasks, and this time it's a post request. Now remember, we've got to provide our access token because this is what identifies us as the user. So in headers, authorization, paste our access token, and because we're creating a task, we need to provide some task details, remember, in the body of the task. So we'll click raw, and then we'll create some JSON body here. Oops, I forgot to select JSON, application JSON from here. So the tasks need some mandatory fields such as task title and things like that. So we'll just say title, and I'm just going to say something like Michael's Michael's task to clean the kitchen. You know, something like that. We're not going to provide a description at the moment because it's not mandatory. You need to provide the completed status. So completed, and then we're just going to say no, that's still outstanding. So in theory, this should create a task for user Michael. So if we click send, scroll up, you can see that we now have a task. So task ID 1, title, Michael's task to clean the kitchen, and then we don't have a description, it's not completed. So what I'm actually going to create another task for Michael. So we're just going to say Michael's task to cut the lawn, and that's not completed, so we'll send that. So now, because our access token is still valid, because it's valid for 20 minutes, we can do sort of whatever we want with this access token against tasks that belong to us. So we've now got 2 tasks. So now if I go back to the get all tasks for my logged in user, we should have 2. So you can see when we previously tried this, we didn't have any. So if I click send, so you can see now Michael has 2. So what we're going to do now is log in as John, and just to make sure that we don't get Michael's tasks. So if I log in as John, so if I go back to our, I can never find it, users, tasks, sessions. So now if I log in as John, so I'll create a new one, to post request, and it's against HTTP, and then it was the sessions API because we're creating a new session, body, raw, and then application JSON, and then we need to provide a username, which was John, and a password, which was password 2. Oops, if I can spell it right. So password 2, if I send that. So you can see now John has a session with us. So now that there's 2 sessions, there's Michael and John. So if I go back to Michael's session here and send, we'll still get Michael's sessions. However, if we copy John's access token and copy that, create a new tab, and we want to get all tasks that belong to John. So localhost, and then we'll use /v1/tasks. So this should list all tasks. Remember, we need to provide John's access token. So under authorization, provide John's access token and send that. So you can see that for the get all tasks, it's per user basis now. So John doesn't have any tasks, but when we go back to Michael, which is his access token here, and send that, Michael has tasks. So you can see there that this is now hooked up on a per user basis. When you log in as Michael, we only get Michael's tasks and being able to update Michael's tasks. And if you log in as John, we only get John's tasks. Now if I quickly create a task for John, create a new tab, post, and it'll be http:// localhost port 8888/v1/tasks. So we're creating a task. Don't forget we need to add in the authorization for John. This is John's access token. And we'll create a body to create a new task. So the task needs a title. And what we're going to call this is John's task to paint the fence. And the task needs a completed status. And we're going to say John hasn't completed this. So we'll send that. So you can see the task's been created. John's task to paint the fence. And now if we go back to get all tasks for John, he didn't have any. So if I send that, now John's got one task. But if we go back to Michael's, which is this one here, and then send that, there you go. So even though John's got a task, Michael can't see them tasks, which is how a system should work. The user should only be able to view their own tasks. So if we quickly go into the phpMyAdmin and click on the tasks table, go to browse, you can now see Michael's tasks here and then John's task. But the important bit that differentiates who these tasks belong to, the ownership, is the user ID at the end. So you can see that these two tasks are belonging to user 1, which it just happens to be that's Michael in our users. I'll go to users table. That belongs to Michael. Obviously number 2 is John, so we'll go back to tasks, browse. Number 2, that belongs to John. Now what I want to do now is to expire an access token. So we'll go to sessions and then browse, and I'm just going to force Michael's access token to expire. So if we just change this and we'll just, change the hour, that access token should now be expired. So now if we go to Postman, and this is Michael's, so now because that's our old access token that's expired, although the user might not know that. So if we try and get all tasks for Michael, send that, you can see the access token has expired. It's a 401 error. So what we need to do now is to call our refresh API. So if I create a new request here, remember to refresh, you patch a session, you update a session. So http localhost port 8888/v1/sessions, and we need to put our session ID at the end of this because we're refreshing a certain session. Now like I say, this is why I kept these tabs open at the top, because I can't remember the session number. It's probably 1 just because we don't have anyone really using this system. So if I just find it, that's our users, that's our get tasks, this is our create session. So the access token is this, and obviously the session ID in this case is 1. I mean that's not always the case. So we'll copy the access token. And we know that it's session 1 because to refresh a session we need the session ID, the old expired access token, but also the refresh token. So if we go back to the patch and session was session ID 1, remember John's session is session 2, so if you're refreshing John's session, this is where you need to put the 2. So in headers we need authorization, and this is where we put Michael's expired access token. And then in the body, we need an application raw, application JSON for the raw. And then this is where we provide our refresh token. Refresh token. If we go back to Michael's login session and copy his refresh token, that's still valid. Go back to this and paste in the refresh token. So if we submit this, we now get, scroll up, we now get a new access token. So So if I copy this, and then if we go back to our get tasks for Michael, where the access token had expired, and replace our old expired access token with the newly refreshed one, and then submit the same request, you can see that we successfully allowed access again. So we went through the whole procedure there of, creating a user, logging in, getting tasks, creating tasks, doing the same for another user. You can see the differentiation between the users and the tasks. We've then expired a session, so if the session's older than 20 minutes, we've refreshed the access token. We've now obviously reused that new access token to continue our user session. Now, obviously, Michael can have multiple sessions that's active, and this goes back to at the beginning of the course where I mentioned that a user might be logged in on a PC, but they also might be logged in on a phone as well. Now, if we didn't create user sessions, we would have to store that same access token against a user. So a user could only have one current access token. Now, that's no good, because if you logged in on a phone and you were already logged in on a PC, that means that the access token would be replaced when you log in on a phone. So then if you go back to the PC, you would then have to log in again. Now, obviously, that's not great from a user experience. You want to be kept logged in where possible, and you can have multiple sessions. So that's the whole concept sort of wrapped up there. I know it's probably a little bit to get your head around, but if you have a mess about with this, you'll be able to see exactly how it works and the logic behind it. And now you can see that actually this is the whole concept that's used amongst the industry, access tokens and things like that. So I'm hoping this has been helpful. That's it for the coding. And in the next video, we're just going to sum up, sort of conclude this course. And I'm just going to show you a simple phone client that I developed just for the basis of this course, just to show you that actually how we can log in, an end user may use this API with a client application. So I'll see you in the next video.